For The Real News, I'm Baynard Woods. After this week's filing deadline, Maryland's gubernatorial race is fully underway, in the middle of an existential crisis in policing caused by the revelations of sweeping corruption in the gun trace task force trials, which ended earlier this month with 2 officers convicted of racketeering and robbery charges and 6 others pleading guilty. Former head of the NAACP, prominent Bernie Sanders surrogate, and Princeton University professor Ben Jealous is one of 8 candidates seeking the Democratic nomination. Today, he released his plan for police reform. He's here with us to talk about the plan. Thanks for being with us, Ben.
Thank you, Baynard.
So your plan's impressive, and I want to go into it in depth, but
Sure.
I want to start with a question that many here in Baltimore are asking. They're saying that the Baltimore Police Department should be disbanded altogether, that it's unreformable. What makes you think that it can be reformed?
The only responsible action is to make big changes. That's absolutely true. I've studied this department for years. I was out there during the Freddie Gray uprisings, literally in a church multi-purpose room, training young people in nonviolent civil disobedience at the request of a local pastor. And listening to folks, being involved in the struggles in the city has led me to the conclusion that we have to do everything we can to restore trust. And that starts with having a special prosecutor in the governor's office who oversees all cases of police misconduct in the state. That includes corruption, that includes the killings of unarmed civilians. It's something that's been done in the past in states like New York when there have been crisis moments like this one. It's worked very well. You have to go further. You have to make sure that the truth can actually get out there. We've had these non-disclosure agreements. The police beat you up, you're paid a settlement, and then you're not supposed to talk to anybody about it. We need to stop that practice. We need to make sure that we end the corruption and overtime. Literally, our policing budget competes with our budget for education. And there's no way that an officer should be able to file a fictitious report, be paid for hours they did not work, and steal money from the city. And we'll make sure that that happens. You know, my family's rooted on the West Side. We've been on the West Side since 1941. You talk to cousins, communities like Upton on the West Side where my mom grew up, they just want the police to work for them. You know, people call a neighborhood a high crime neighborhood, but what that really means, it's a high rate of victimization neighborhood. And it's where folks really need the police to be on their side. In order to do that, we're going to have to change the way policing's done, and we're going to need to even change who we recruit. A lot of what we talk about in this report is about what it will take to actually create a deeper pipeline of officers coming from the city. And frankly, officers who start off with the right type of personality, not predisposed to bias or to violence.
So you were talking about high crime neighborhoods and areas, and after the death of Sean Suter, the detective in Harlem Park, the neighborhood was locked down for nearly a week. We still haven't gotten any answers about that, and this idea of a special prosecutor is really interesting. So maybe this case could help us see, like, what could a special prosecutor do to help us figure out what actually happened there, both to the detective and in the aftermath of that? How would it work?
Well, yeah, if you look at the gun trace task force case, which you covered closely, one of the very disturbing things, right, was that these bad officers, I mean, who were really bad, were involved in drug trafficking and terrorizing a community, appeared to have informants inside of the Internal Affairs Division, inside of the state's attorney's office. The relationship is too cozy when the police are policing the police. And so you've got to have a special prosecutor, somebody who's outside of that framework, somebody who's not, you know, who they or their boss isn't running for office and dollars from the FOP, who can take control of the situation and get to the bottom of it. What was most disturbing about Detective Suter, of course, was he was killed the day before he was supposed to testify.
Right.
And it appears like another officer may have been involved, or somebody working with a dirty officer who he was going to testify against. And that added insult to injury after the community was sort of treated like everybody was suspect, to learn that it may have been somebody in law enforcement. That's the type of deep violation of trust that we're seeking to address.
Right, and so your plan brings in civilian oversight in a number of ways on trial boards, of the department as a whole, and uses models like Seattle's consent decree, Cleveland's consent decree as improvements over the one that Baltimore entered into with the Department of Justice. Is there any way that you would allow there to be, and I want to go into some of those details, but that you would allow there to be civilians who are hiring and firing the commissioner? We just got a new commissioner sworn in this morning. How does the police department get controlled under your plan? Well,
yeah, I mean, the commissioner should be fully accountable to the mayor, right? And the mayors are the ultimate civilian. Under our plan, the idea is to frankly get our police department accountable to our democracy. Get a strong civilian complaint review board with teeth. Get civilians involved in these trials. Right now, we have officers trying officers inside the police department. And we've seen from these cases that oftentimes you have corrupt officers amongst the 3-officer panel. Again, it's too cozy and it's easily corrupted. And that's why you need to be able to put civilians on those internal review boards. At the same time, what this is about fundamentally is let's make the department accountable to the people again. And let's get the people of the city coming in to work as officers again. When I was young, the reason I became a criminologist, and I now teach criminal justice at Princeton, is my granddad was my hero. And my granddad was a probation officer here in the city. When he retired for about 30 years, he was chief of juvenile probation for Baltimore for the western part of the city. And I remember in the early 1980s, I was a young boy, I was probably 8, 9 years old. And the shootings were going up every summer. It was getting more and more violent every summer. And I said to my granddad one summer as he was putting his badge in his pocket and about to walk out the door, "Granddad, don't you ever get scared? Some of these kids are kind of dangerous. Don't you ever get scared?" He said, "Of course I do." And that's why I tell all of them, here is my address. I get home at 6 o'clock sharp every night. If you've just had the worst day of your life, which could mean that they've killed somebody, and you don't know what to do, you just come sit on my steps. When I get home, we'll figure it out together. What my grandfather understood was no one became a victimizer unless they had been victimized themselves. These young people were often in a kill or be killed situation that was terrifying. And that if we showed courage today, life would get better tomorrow. But he was fueled by a courage that came from a love for the West Side because he had raised my mom half her childhood in the McCullough Homes housing projects. And the other half split between Pulaski Street and Longwood. And so when he was more successful and older and lived out in Ashburn, he still had a love for the entire West Side and a connection to families across the West Side and a conviction that we were all in this together. There's no us and them. There's just us.
So yeah, I mean, after the death of Freddie Gray and the curfew, there was a strong feeling that the police here were like an occupying army, and 75% of officers aren't living here. The Gun Trace Task Force
many are in Pennsylvania.
Right, not even in a state. The Gun Trace Task Force complicated that a little bit, where and some people are pushing back on the idea of local hiring, because we have people like Gondo, Detective Gondo, who was simultaneously part of a drug crew here with his, one of his childhood friends. We have Herschel, whose mother was in Little Italy, and he'd stop by on duty and be using overtime while he was hanging out with his mom. How would you answer those critics who say that being too close to the community may also be a problem?
Never, ever, ever is the solution to default to an occupying force.
Right.
The force should be of the people. And yes, the force then has to be held accountable. Under any scenario, you can have somebody stopping to see their mom on any job where you have a vehicle and you're moving around. But then somebody should be auditing, right? And there should be good supervision. That'll take care of that. On the issue of officers who are prone to criminality, we should be weeding them out multiple ways. One, you've got to have a clean internal affairs division. Right. And that's why you've got to have an independent prosecutor overseeing it. At the same time, you've got to make sure that you're filtering out people, that you're doing the correct background checks. One of the things that we talk about in here is creating a cadet program that's even bigger than the one that we have, and a more robust apprenticeship program. So young people, the way that they are in Northern Europe, are training in high school to go into the police department, and therefore don't have time to be in a gang. So it's fundamentally about bringing more integrity bringing greater accountability, getting the police out of the business of being the only ones who police the police, and getting them back being accountable to the people, and frankly, being not just for the people, if you will, but of the people of the city.
Right, so a couple of things on integrity. The new commissioner has called for random integrity checks without being clear of what that would even look like. Maybe polygraphs, maybe tests, having money to see, setting people up to see if they would do that. And then on the trial boards, the mayor has called for giving the commissioner the right to fire officers, even if they're found not guilty by a trial board. Do you support those positions?
I think that the mayor's suggestion is spot on. The reality is that you can have a trial board internal that could have a bad officer on it that could find you not guilty of something you were guilty of. And you could have a chief who, after decades of experience, has just come to the conclusion that there's a pattern here that makes him feel uneasy or makes her feel uneasy. And that chief needs to have the right, like any other employer, to say, I just got a bad feeling about you, and you carry a gun every day, so no, you can't work here anymore. We go further in this report, and we say there should actually be a database for the entire state of every officer involved shooting, and it should be searchable by the public.
Right.
Too often you have an officer who's fired in one place and hired somewhere else, and they don't know why that officer was fired. They don't know who that officer is. And what we know from personality tests of officers is there's a very narrow band of officers who are predisposed to kill unarmed civilians. And so we also advocate for using those personality tests differently, so we weed them out in the front end. Right now, we're giving all of them personality tests, but we're actually not using them to weed out the officers who are most predisposed to violence. We need to change that.
So, we know that one of the main problems with crime here in Baltimore is just lack of opportunity, lack of money. And so we have the war on drugs, which creates this drug trade, which then creates things like the gun trace task force. And yet we also spend more than something like $490 million a year on the police budget. How do we reconcile those things, putting money into the police department instead of the community? What else would you propose that we do for the community to reverse that scenario? So
our policy proposals on policing sit inside of an overall policy framework. Other key elements include raising the minimum wage statewide to $15 per hour. That's important not just to workers. It's important to their kids. You have a lot of parents working 2 or 3 jobs. Well, if you raise the minimum wage 50% from $10.10 to $15, now they can work 1 less job. It might not get you from 3 to 1, but it'll get you from 3 to 2. That's more time at home with the kids. That's important. It's also more money in the community. When when we as a nation and as a state delinked the minimum wage from inflation, we didn't just hurt workers or their families. We hurt entire communities where these workers are clustered. And the thing is that when you're working for a minimum wage, you're not storing your savings over in Switzerland. You're spending it within 2 miles of your house.
Right.
My cousin owns a flower shop on the west side, and she came out and supported the $15 minimum wage. And she said, yeah, I'm gonna have to pay my workers a little more, but I probably should be. But I don't just own a flower shop that happens to be located here. I sell flowers here. And I'll sell more flowers if the folks in my area are being paid more. We've also said we've also put out a plan. I'm the only candidate for governor in Maryland with a plan to provide health care for everybody in the state, to get to a state-based Medicare for all here in Maryland. That's critical because health care for all means mental health care for all. A lot of the violence in the streets are people who are suffering, get this, not from post-traumatic stress disorder, from continuous traumatic stress disorder. It's only post when you get to leave the war zone. We have young people who suffer CTSD at a higher rate than returning soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq suffer PTSD. And unlike the soldiers, they don't get access to mental health care. That will make officers a lot more safe very quickly. It will also change their interactions in the community. At the same time, I'll be absolutely committed to, across the state, dealing with these pockets of unemployment and pockets of persistent youth unemployment. One of the best things you can do to change the character of a community is to make it easier for young people to find work. And we'll be focused on a range of private-public partnerships to get more young people into jobs every summer and to create community schools to keep kids busier after school every day.
So, I mean, all of those are really progressive proposals, and you're probably the most progressive candidate in the Democratic field in this election, and certainly
amongst the three frontrunners.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so, I mean, but one of the impediments to all of these reforms in policing that you make is the police union, the FOP, and the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. How do you, as a union-supporting progressive and someone trying to make police reform, how do you reconcile those positions, and how do you deal with the FOP?
Yeah, I'm a believer in unions, and I believe that every public employee has the right to organize, including police officers. There was a time when these unions were founded because officers needed representation on typical kind of OSHA issues, you know, safety and health issues, wage and hour issues. I support the FOP for that. I believe, though, that they've crossed a line when they have become a force for electing the state's attorneys who oversee issues of integrity and corruption.
Right.
You know, I believe that they've crossed a line when they get involved in mayor's races who oversee the commissioner. The FOP, quite frankly, will find in me somebody who is absolutely a supporter of their right to organize, and also a very effective organizer who's not afraid of anyone.
So one more question on the political front. You are a big supporter of Bernie Sanders. And yet your running mate you've chosen is someone who is deeply Democratic establishment, Susan Turnbull. And I was just happened to be talking to someone at lunch today who said she wanted to host a fundraiser, and because of now worrying that you're sort of going establishment, doesn't want to do that anymore.
First of all, ask your friend Dick call me. Susie, you should understand, was pushed aside at the DNC to make room for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. No connection between her and Debbie. I don't think there's even a friendship there. She was vice chair of the DNC under Howard Dean. And that was a very different DNC. It's a DNC that was about a 50-state strategy, about building from the bottom up and creating a more inclusive party. At the time, that was the most, this is before Obama, that was the most kind of progressive campaign that came close. And she was part of that revolution, which ultimately is a kind of a straight line between what Howard Dean did and what Bernie would do later. When she was chair of the Maryland Party in 2010, they put 10 times more organizers on the ground than we did in 2014 and turned out 125,000 more voters. And she's the only woman to have been head of 2 national Jewish organizations, and she co-founded Emerge Maryland, which has helped a bunch of not just women, but progressive women run for office all over the state. So I would love to introduce your friend to Susie. I think find what I've found. But I'll tell you this, a funny thing. I said I was only going to run with somebody who would support our efforts to legalize cannabis, to provide health care for everybody in the state, to fully fund education, and to end the massive student debt crisis by ending mass incarceration. And I talked to some progressives, noted progressives, leading progressives in the state, who were unwilling to go all the way there on one or all of those.
Wow.
Susie, and this is what it's going to take. I mean, Martin Luther King, I was trained by some of his lieutenants down south when I was a young organizer in Mississippi. And one of his sayings, I haven't found it in any book, but multiple of his lieutenants repeated to me was, Dr. King would say, if you are comfortable in your coalition, and your coalition is too small, what I do as an organizer is I build big, robust coalitions. And that means that it has to be big enough that that not everybody knows everybody. And that we all have to keep reminding ourselves we're here to get something done. That's how I led the state in abolishing the death penalty just a few years after Martin O'Malley tried and did not succeed. That's how I led the state as the co-chair of the successful campaign to pass the DREAM Act. And that's how, frankly, I helped to bring black church leaders to the table to at least not oppose marriage equality, as we put organizers on the ground, the NAACP, to pass marriage equality. Leadership requires that you keep stepping beyond your comfort zone and expanding that coalition around core principles that will change our lives, real people's lives in real time. That's what I'm committed to doing.
Well, thanks so much for coming out and talking with us. We look forward to following the rest of the campaign.
Appreciate you, Ben.
Here with Ben Jealous, I am Baynard Woods for the Real News Network.